When self-appointed HOA President Karen claimed ownership over John's private driveway, she underestimated the resolve of a single father fighting for his rights. Her manipulative rule, secret bylaw changes, and misuse of HOA funds outraged the entire community. But with determination, legal help, and damning evidence, John turned the tide in this explosive battle. Just wait until you hear how justice prevailed and why Karen's reign came to a dramatic end. John Miller stood in his sunlit garage, a sense of calm washing over him as he adjusted the handlebars on his daughter Emily's bike. The faint hum of birdsong mixed with the soft clinking of tools, and for a brief moment, life felt perfectly serene. John had worked tirelessly to build this life, a modest home in a quiet Colorado Springs neighborhood where Emily could grow up safely. To him, their house was more than just walls and a roof. It was a promise of stability after years of sacrifice. As he wheeled the bike onto the driveway, his pleasant morning took a sudden turn. A hulking black SUV sat parked squarely across his driveway, blocking any chance of getting his car out. John frowned, his calm now tinged with confusion. It wasn't unusual for cars to be parked along the curb, but this was deliberate. Someone had gone out of their way to inconvenience him. He walked out, shielding his eyes from the glare of the sun, when a familiar figure emerged from behind the SUV, Karen Simmons, of course. She was the self-appointed president of the HOA, a title she wore like a crown. Karen strutted toward him, clipboard in hand, her pastel blazer and perfectly coiffed hair, a stark contrast to the frustration now bubbling inside John. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Karen said with a saccharine smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm here on behalf of the HOA to inform you that your driveway is now part of our Community Overflow Parking Initiative. We've allocated it for shared use, so you'll need to park your car on the street from now on." John blinked, struggling to process her words. "Wait, what? My driveway? That's private property. It's part of my deed." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her tone grew sharper. "There's been a new amendment to the bylaws, Mr. Miller. The HOA has jurisdiction over all driveways in the neighborhood. It's in the best interest of the community, of course." John's heart sank. He wasn't one to pick fights, but this was absurd. "I'm sorry, but I've never seen or agreed to anything like that. Could you show me the amendment?" Karen let out a condescending chuckle and tapped her clipboard. "It's all here. I'd recommend you take some time to familiarize yourself with the updated rules. Not everyone reads the bylaws as thoroughly as I do." Her smugness was infuriating. John could feel the weight of her gaze as she waited for him to concede, but he wasn't about to back down. "With all due respect, Karen, I need to see actual proof of this so-called amendment. Otherwise, I'm not moving my car." Karen's smirk deepened as she gestured toward the SUV. "Suit yourself, but the car stays." Frustration boiled over as John realized she wasn't going to budge. He knew better than to escalate things verbally. So instead, he did what any homeowner protecting their rights would do. He called the towing company. Within the hour, the black SUV was gone, leaving Karen fuming on the curb. John should have felt relief, but as he watched Karen storm off, he had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. Her parting words echoed in his mind. "You'll regret this, Mr. Miller." Monday morning arrived, with the crisp chill of autumn in the air. John sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee as the golden light poured through the window. Emily was upstairs getting ready for school, her laughter echoing faintly through the house. It was a moment of peace that John had learned to treasure, but it wouldn't last long. A sharp knock at the door shattered the calm. Setting his mug down, John opened the door to find a neatly folded letter tucked into an official HOA envelope on his doormat. The sight of the logo made his stomach tighten. With a sinking feeling, he tore the envelope open and began to read. The letter was as infuriating as it was ridiculous. It accused John of violating the HOA's so-called community parking agreement and demanded that he reimburse Karen for the towing fee. The penalty? A staggering $1,500, accompanied by a thinly veiled warning. Failure to comply would result in further action. John's hands gripped the paper tightly as frustration bubbled inside him. How could they justify this? His driveway was his property, plain and simple. News of the letter traveled quickly through the neighborhood. At the local coffee shop, Mrs. Roberts, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the area for decades, leaned in close to John. "You're not the first one she's done this to, you know," she whispered. "Karen made me repaint my house last spring. Said the color was too loud." "Can you imagine? I chose beige." Another neighbor chimed in, recounting how Karen had fined him $50 for leaving his trash bin out for a few minutes after collection. The stories poured in like a flood, each one painting Karen as more overbearing than the last. John's irritation turned to resolve. This wasn't just about his driveway anymore. This was about standing up to Karen's unchecked power. Determined to address the issue head-on, John decided to attend the next HOA meeting. That evening, he walked into the community center, his steps steady but his heart racing. The room was a sea of folding chairs and murmuring voices, but all fell silent when Karen entered, flanked by her loyal board members. She carried herself with the air of someone who believed she was untouchable. John waited his turn to speak, using every ounce of patience he had to remain calm. When his name was finally called, he stood and addressed the room. "I'm here to ask for clarification on the so-called amendment that grants the HOA control over private driveways. I've reviewed my deed, and it explicitly states that my driveway is private property. So, where is this amendment?" Karen's lips curled into a smile that was anything but friendly. She waved a thick packet of papers, her movements theatrical. "Mr. Miller, it's all right here in the updated bylaws. These changes were made for the betterment of the community. I'm sure you understand." John took a step forward, his voice steady. "May I see them?" Karen's expression hardened. "It's not your place to question the board's decisions." The room grew tense as John's frustration became palpable. He scanned the faces of his neighbors, searching for some sign of support, but many avoided his gaze. Karen's presence was like a shadow over the entire room, silencing dissent with a mere glance. "I have every right to question decisions that affect my property," John replied, his voice firm, "and I'll keep asking until I get answers." Karen leaned back in her chair, her smile returning as she crossed her arms. "Well, Mr. Miller, you're welcome to continue questioning, but let me remind you, the HOA operates in the best interest of everyone here. Perhaps you should consider whether your actions align with that mission." The subtle threat hung in the air as John returned to his seat. Frustrated and cornered, he realized Karen's arrogance wasn't just personal, it was systemic. This wasn't about one driveway or one neighbor, it was about power, and Karen wasn't about to give it up easily. As the meeting adjourned, John stepped into the cool evening air, his mind racing. Karen had made it clear she wasn't going to back down, but neither would he. The fight had just begun. Late one evening, John sat in his dimly lit office, surrounded by stacks of documents and a growing determination. The quiet hum of the house was broken only by the rustle of papers as he pored over his property deed and HOA regulations. The evidence was clear. The HOA could not amend bylaws without a formal vote, and his driveway was explicitly listed as private property in the original neighborhood plat. Karen's claims were not just baseless, they were outright deceptive. Determined to take action, John reached out to Sarah Jensen, a sharp and meticulous attorney specializing in HOA disputes. When he met her, Sarah wasted no time diving into the details. "Karen's behavior isn't unusual," Sarah explained, "but what stands out here is her complete disregard for process. Let's see how deep this goes." Within days, Sarah's investigation uncovered shocking truths. Karen had been unilaterally amending HOA bylaws without notifying homeowners, a blatant violation of HOA regulations. Even worse, financial records revealed troubling discrepancies. Karen had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including the very SUV she'd parked in John's driveway. "Not only is she overstepping," Sarah remarked, "she's abusing her authority for personal gain. This is bigger than just your driveway." Determined to protect himself, John installed security cameras around his property to document Karen's behavior. It wasn't long before his precaution paid off. One afternoon, he returned home to find another car parked in his driveway, a bright red sedan. Karen stood nearby, watching with a smug expression. "This is private property, Karen," John said, his phone recording every word. Karen folded her arms. "I own this driveway now. Deal with it." Her words, dripping with arrogance, became John's most damning piece of evidence. When Sarah reviewed the footage, she smiled. "This changes everything," she said. Meanwhile, word of Karen's overreach spread through the neighborhood. Neighbors, once reluctant to speak up, began sharing their own stories. Mrs. Roberts, the retired school teacher, described how Karen had forced her to repaint her home, claiming the color wasn't community approved. Another neighbor revealed being fined over a trash bin left out for less than an hour. Frustration turned into action. Together, John and his neighbors formed a coalition, demanding transparency from the HOA. They drafted a letter signed by dozens of residents, outlining Karen's abuses and demanding a formal review of her actions. For John, seeing the neighborhood unite was both humbling and inspiring. As he stood in his driveway, watching the security camera light blink reassuringly, he knew the tides were finally turning. Karen's reign of unchecked authority was crumbling, and justice was on the horizon. The day of the trial arrived, bringing a mix of anticipation and tension. The small courtroom buzzed with whispers as neighbors filled the benches, eager to witness the showdown between John and Karen. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the room where justice would soon be served. John sat at the plaintiff's table, his attorney Sarah Jensen by his side. Her calm, confident demeanor was a steadying presence as John braced himself for what lay ahead. Karen entered with her usual air of superiority, her pastel suit pressed to perfection, and her clipboard nowhere in sight. But behind her composed exterior, there was a flicker of unease. It wasn't just John she was facing, it was the collective frustration of an entire neighborhood. As proceedings began, Sarah methodically laid out the case. She started with the bylaws, presenting copies of the original documents that clearly defined the driveways as private property. Karen's claim that the HOA had jurisdiction was baseless. No amendment could be made without a community vote, and no such vote had ever occurred. The courtroom murmured as Sarah detailed how Karen had overstepped her authority, but the true bombshell came when Sarah introduced the financial records. The carefully compiled evidence revealed a pattern of misuse. HOA funds used to pay for Karen's personal expenses, including maintenance for the SUV she had so boldly parked in John's driveway. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Sarah continued, each detail painting a picture of blatant misconduct. Karen, who had begun the trial with an air of smugness, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her attorney attempted to dismiss the evidence as misunderstandings, but Sarah wasn't finished. She played the footage from John's security cameras, where Karen's own voice could be heard declaring, "I own this driveway now, deal with it." The weight of her arrogance was undeniable. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she tried to spin the narrative. "Everything I've done was for the good of the community," she insisted, her voice tinged with desperation. "My actions were misunderstood. I only wanted to maintain order and harmony." The judge, a stern woman with an air of no-nonsense authority, leaned forward. "Miss Simmons," she said, her tone firm, "what you've done is not for the good of the community. It is a gross abuse of power and a clear violation of both legal and ethical standards." The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Karen was ordered to personally reimburse John for all towing fees, legal expenses, and emotional damages, a total of $25,000. But that wasn't all. The court also mandated a full audit of the HOA's finances, a process that would undoubtedly uncover more of Karen's misdeeds. Most significantly, the judge called for Karen's immediate removal as HOA president, effective that day. As the gavel struck, a wave of relief washed over John. The neighbors in the courtroom erupted into quiet cheers, their long-simmering frustrations finally vindicated. Karen, now stripped of her authority, left the room with her head low, her once commanding presence diminished. John stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp autumn air, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The battle had been long and exhausting, but justice had prevailed. As his neighbors gathered around him, their words of gratitude and support reminded him that this victory wasn't just his. It belonged to the entire community. For the first time in months, John felt truly at peace. Karen's reign was over, and the neighborhood could finally begin to heal. The courtroom victory marked a turning point for the neighborhood. With Karen gone, the HOA began a new chapter, led by a board committed to fairness and transparency. Meetings became open forums where neighbors worked together to rewrite bylaws, ensuring abuses like Karen's would never happen again. For John, the fight was a reminder of the power of standing up for what's right. One sunny afternoon, as he and Emily planted flowers along their driveway, he felt a deep sense of pride. The once contentious space was now a symbol of their resilience. "Dad," Emily said, her hands covered in dirt, "we won, didn't we?" John smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, and we proved that no one is above the law." The neighborhood, once divided, grew closer. Neighbors greeted each other warmly, their community rebuilt on trust and unity. The driveway, lined with vibrant flowers, now stood as a reminder of what they'd overcome, a symbol of strength, justice, and the power of working together. For John, that was the greatest victory of all,